All right, so I'd like to take a minute to discuss geometry issues, whether they're related to trying to remesh and getting a bad result, or whether it is related to 3D printing. If you have your 3D print tab that you added from preferences and you checked all, sometimes you're going to get these results, and I think we should probably discuss some of those. It's important to know what some of these are and what the meaning is. So you can see that there's some things that are not quite right with this geometry. Another thing sometimes that I'll do is I will shade smooth, and sometimes that'll make some things even more apparent as far as being able to see problems. But anyway, if we are in edit mode and we click on non-manifold edges, we can see that there's some issues that are selected, some that are going on. So let's take a look here. All right, well, here's something going on here that seems pretty apparent. So if I grab this, I can see that I've got this face that was sort of overlapping things that's attached to all these points, but there's no thickness to it other than being attached to those 4 points. It's not really attached to any of the other geometry, and it doesn't make a solid. I mean, that face in essence is zero thickness, even though we can see it. So that would be an example. Um, let's take a look at some other things that are going on. Okay, I've got a number of edges that are, let's take a look at that edge right here. What's going on? Okay, so I've got like this edge that seems to be connected inside the mesh somewhere that is skirting across the surface, even though it's not connected to any of the other items that it was passing through. Well, that's definitely a problem. So any number of things like that might be an issue. I think actually, let's take a look at this. If I grab this, yeah, so there's another issue where I have these faces, but there's no corresponding face here. So creating a hole in the mesh. I've got a number of holes in the mesh, so that would be part of the problem as well, because in essence, this is a non-watertight object. So it gives you kind of a sense. Basically, what we're looking at for non-manifold edges is sort of this impossible geometry that makes a mesh porous or creates inconsistencies in it. So bad contiguous edges, let's take a look and see what we have there. I have something going on. So, all right, there we go. If we are in object mode, we can see that there's something happening with the shading, that is different. So that gives us a clue as well. If I am up here and I am go to my normals, showing which way the faces are facing, you can see that all the normals are facing outward, or at least most of them, except that one that had the bad edge. And yeah, there it is. It's pointing inside. So flipping the normal on that would probably resolve that issue. So let's turn the normals back off. It's a nice tool, but it is definitely a little distracting sometimes. So intersecting faces, well, I think a good example is down here at the bottom. When I created this, I took a cube, I took a sphere, I overlapped them, and I joined them. I didn't do a Boolean or anything like that. So the result was I've got all of these faces that are going into the cube. And if we look at them in X-ray mode, we can see that they actually extend into the cube, creating overlapping faces without attaching to the cube itself. So that becomes confusing and difficult as well. In a case like that, I mean, the best thing I probably could have done would be to join them with a Boolean so that was figured out. It's always better to do things right the first time if you can, but sometimes you just don't know. Zero faces. Let's take a look at zero faces. I've got a whole bunch right here, and there's a couple of scenarios here. Um, Even though these faces have an actual size to them, they are small enough based on what is expected for the 3D printer that they are in essence zero. So even though they have a size, they kind of don't. But there's more to it than that, because there's a zero face here as well. If I grab this vertex and just move some of these vertices around, you will see that I had a face there the whole time, but I had all of these vertices at the same spot, in essence, creating a non existent face, even though there was a face. And the problem with a lot of these things is sometimes the problem will be right there in front of you and you just don't see it. It looks fine to me. It looks like I joined a bunch of vertices and everything is all good. When in fact, what really happened was I had a face selected and I accidentally pushed scale 0. Same thing is going on here. If I grab this vertex and slide it over, we'll see that I had moved these vertices over on top of these, in essence, creating a 0 face. Okay, so 0 edges, I seem to have those as well. Similar issue. And what we can do here is let's grab this face, because I'm pretty sure I have one here. Yep. So if I'm looking for my 0 faces, or my 0 edges, you can see that there's part of the issue. And again, it was something that you can't necessarily see. It depends on what I did or how I did it. That I extruded this, and then I deleted some faces, and then I decided to push it back down into place, and that created this problem. So sometimes these problems are not apparent. Non-flat faces. I've got a couple right down here, and it's just basically impossible geometry. If we look at the vertices, you can see that this is a single face, but these vertices don't exist on the same x-axis. And that in essence creates kind of a curve where there shouldn't be a curve. And you can kind of see it if we're in face select mode and we start moving around, that these things don't quite jive or match up. There's some wonkiness happening there that can't exist in the real world. And then if we move on to thin faces and sharp edges, I mean, they're very specifically related to what your settings are here. Blender doesn't necessarily know what printer you're using if you're going to be 3D printing this, so it doesn't know what is necessarily impossible. But in essence, these faces are so thin that the printer will not be able to, at least so far as we know, will not be able to print these. Likewise, if we talk about the sharp edges, kind of the same thing, right? Is that, now think about the scale of this thing. What is this object right now? If I'm in object mode. So yeah, it's a 2-meter object, but we've got some very tiny details that are fractions of an inch happening down here. So basically what's happening is if I extend this out, what's happening is that edge is getting so thin that if we were to try printing it, it just becomes razor thin. And at some point, probably back here, the printer can no longer print and maintain that edge. It got too skinny to be printable. Some of these things can be fixed by merging the geometry or thickening things up a little bit or moving it back a bit. But we can deal with possible solutions at a different time. So lastly, overhanging faces. Well, if we click on this, we can see what's happening here. And let's imagine that I'm printing this thing, 3D printing, and I've got it sitting on the build plate like this. Well, you're basically printing over thin air as your extruder moves up. Likewise here, it's printing over completely thin air. It's got nothing to attach itself to. The 3D print the Blender doesn't know how you're orienting this thing. I mean, I may well be that I'm printing it this way without these faces that I extended down that I just, you know, was messing around with. In which case, these overhanging faces become a non-issue up here. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts or the basics of what some of these things mean. We can deal with solutions and a couple of different ways of dealing with these issues as well.